In February of 2025, a Scottish archaeologist named Piers Litherland stood at the entrance of a tomb that had been hidden for 3,500 years beneath the desert west of Luxor, and burst into tears. When I came out, he later told the BBC, "My wife was waiting outside, and the only thing I could do was burst into tears." When you come across something that you are not expecting to find, it is emotionally extremely turbulent. The tomb he had found, a passage cut into the rock of a remote wadi called Gabanat el Kurud, approximately 2.5 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings, was not what his team had been looking for. They had been searching for the tombs of royal wives. They had been conducting survey work in a valley that everyone assumed was associated with queens, not kings. They had been following a decade of careful, methodical, unglamorous archaeological fieldwork, the kind of work that rarely makes headlines and that proceeds, season after season, through the patient removal of sand and rubble and the meticulous documentation of every potsherd and plaster fragment that the desert surrenders. And then the desert surrendered something that no one expected: a wide staircase, an imposing doorway, a corridor that descended into darkness, and on the walls and ceiling of the burial chamber at the end of that corridor, blue-painted inscriptions, yellow stars against a dark ground, and fragments of the Book of the Amduat, the sacred funerary text that was reserved, in the New Kingdom, exclusively for the burials of pharaohs. This was not a queen's tomb, this was a king's tomb, and when the fragments of shattered alabaster jars were pieced together, and the inscriptions were read, the name they spelled was one that Egyptology had been searching for since the 19th century. A name that belonged to the most elusive, the most overlooked, and the most misunderstood pharaoh of the great 18th Dynasty. The name was Thutmose II, Akheperenre, the missing pharaoh. The discovery was announced by the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities as the first royal tomb found in Egypt since Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, a claim that, while debatable in its strictest archaeological sense, captures the genuine significance of the find. For more than a century, the tomb of Thutmose II had been the last missing royal tomb of the 18th Dynasty, the final piece of a puzzle that had been incomplete since the birth of modern Egyptology, the only pharaoh of that extraordinary lineage whose final resting place had never been identified. His father's tomb was known, his son's tomb was known, his wife's tomb was known, his grandson's tomb was known. Every other pharaoh of the dynasty that had liberated Egypt from the Hyksos and built the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen had been accounted for. Every tomb located, every burial identified, every pharaoh given his place in the archaeological record. Every pharaoh except one, the quiet one, the forgotten one. The pharaoh who ruled between two of the most famous figures in Egyptian history. His father, Thutmose I, the warrior who marched to the Euphrates, and his wife, Hatshepsut, the woman who made herself king, and who vanished so completely from the historical record that some scholars wondered whether he had accomplished anything at all. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Thutmose II really was. Not the cipher, the footnote, the historical blank that later ages made of him. Not the footnote between his famous father and his famous wife, but the man himself. You are going to understand the dynasty he was born into, the political pressures that shaped his reign, and the shadow that Hatshepsut cast over his legacy. You are going to understand the extraordinary discovery of 2025. The tomb in the desert, the alabaster fragments, the blue-painted ceiling, and the tantalizing possibility of a second, undisturbed tomb that may still lie hidden beneath a mound of rubble in the Wadi Gabanat el Kurud. And you are going to understand what it means for a pharaoh to be forgotten, what it costs, what it reveals about the selective, biased, politically contaminated nature of historical memory, and why the recovery of the forgotten is in many ways more important than the celebration of the remembered. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. The discovery raises questions that go far beyond the identification of a single tomb. It challenges the narrative that Egyptology has constructed about the early 18th dynasty, a narrative in which Thutmose II is a placeholder, a transitional figure, a weak king whose only significance lies in his relationships to the powerful people around him. The tomb in the Wadi tells a different story. It tells the story of a pharaoh who was buried with the full honours of kingship, the amduat on his walls, the alabaster vessels inscribed with his royal name, the funerary furniture that no museum in the world, not the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, not the British Museum, not the Louvre, not the Metropolitan Museum of Art, had ever possessed. Whatever later is made of Thutmose II, whatever his wife did to his memory, whatever his son allowed to be forgotten, the people who buried him treated him as a king, and the desert, which has a longer memory than any dynasty, kept that secret for 35 centuries until a Scottish archaeologist named Piers Litherland and a dedicated Egyptian-British team, including the experienced archaeologists Mohsen Kamel, Ashraf Omar Ali, Heraji Syed Ahmed, and the geoarchaeologist Judith Bunbury, came looking for something else entirely and found instead the long-awaited answer to one of the oldest and most persistent questions in Egyptology, to understand the world that Thutmose II inhabited, and the forces that would shape both his reign and his afterlife in the historical record. We need to understand the dynasty he was born into. The 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt is, by any measure, the most extraordinary sequence of rulers in the history of the pharaonic state. It is the dynasty that liberated Egypt from the Hyksos. It is the dynasty that built the New Kingdom. It is the dynasty that produced Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, names that even people with no interest in ancient history recognize, names that have entered the vocabulary of global culture as synonyms for power, mystery, and the grandeur of the ancient world. The 18th dynasty ruled Egypt for approximately 250 years, from around 1550 to around 1292 BC, and during that period, it transformed the Nile Valley Kingdom into the greatest imperial power of the Bronze Age, an empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in the south to the banks of the Euphrates in the north, encompassing territories in modern-day Egypt, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and possibly parts of Turkey. Thutmose II was born into this dynasty at a moment of extraordinary dynamism and equally extraordinary tension. The extraordinary dynasty had begun with Ahmose I, the boy king who had driven the Hyksos from the delta, who had chased them across the Sinai, who had besieged their fortress at Sharuan for 3 years, and who had reunified Egypt for the third time in its history. Ahmose had been succeeded by his son Amenhotep I, a capable administrator and builder who had consolidated the gains of the liberation and who had prepared the ground for the imperial expansion that was to follow. Amenhotep had died without a male heir, and the throne had passed, through the mechanisms of military merit and royal marriage that would become characteristic of the early 18th dynasty, to a soldier named Thutmose, who became Thutmose I. Thutmose I had been, as we have explored, a soldier of non-royal blood who had married into the royal family and had seized the throne, becoming, through a combination of military genius and political opportunity, the architect of Egyptian imperial expansion. Thutmose I had marched an Egyptian army to the banks of the Euphrates, had pushed the Nubian frontier past the Fourth Cataract, and had established the strategic framework that would guide Egyptian foreign policy for the next 4 centuries. He was, by any standard, one of the most consequential and most important pharaohs in Egyptian history, a transformative figure whose campaigns reshaped the political geography of the ancient Near East, a transformative figure whose achievements defined the era. But Thutmose I's personal life was as complicated as his political career. He had at least 2 wives, Ahmose, his principal queen, who carried the legitimacy of the royal bloodline, and Mutnefret, a secondary wife whose royal status is debated but who was probably of lesser rank. Ahmose bore Thutmose I a daughter, Hatshepsut, who would become one of the most famous rulers in the history of the ancient world. Mutnefret bore him a son, Thutmose, who would become Thutmose II. The distinction between the 2 mothers was more than a matter of domestic protocol. It was a question of legitimacy. In the Egyptian royal system, the claim to the throne flowed through the female line, through the great royal wife, the principal queen, whose blood carried the divine authority that legitimized the kingship. Hatshepsut, as the daughter of the great royal wife Ahmose, carried this authority. Thutmose II, as the son of the secondary wife Euphrates, did not. The solution to this problem was as old as the pharaonic system itself: marriage. Thutmose II married his half-sister Hatshepsut, uniting his claim to the throne, which derived from his status as the surviving son of the previous pharaoh, with her legitimacy, which derived from her mother's position as great royal wife. The marriage was a political arrangement designed to secure the succession and to prevent the kind of dynastic instability that had plagued Egyptian history in the past. The marriage must be understood in its political context. The Egyptian royal family of the early 18th Dynasty was a small, intensely interconnected group of people who knew each other intimately, who had grown up together in the same palace, who had shared the same tutors, the same rituals, the same ceremonies, the same confined world of the Theban court. Thutmose and Hatshepsut were not strangers united by a diplomatic arrangement between distant kingdoms. They were siblings, half-siblings, sharing the same father, raised in the same household, aware from childhood of each other's existence and of the political calculations that would eventually bring them together. Whether this proximity bred affection or resentment, whether the knowledge that they would one day be married shaped their childhood interactions, whether the young Hatshepsut looked at her half-brother with warmth or with the cold appraisal of a woman who knew she was destined to share his throne, whether the young Thutmose looked at his brilliant, ambitious half-sister with admiration, jealousy, love, or fear, is a question that the sources do not answer. What the sources do tell us is that the marriage created a political dynamic that was unprecedented in Egyptian history, a dynamic in which the queen carried more legitimacy than the king, in which the woman's blood was more royal than the man's, and in which the question of who actually governed Egypt during their shared time on the throne, who made the military decisions, who directed the building programs, who managed the foreign affairs, who held the real power behind the ceremonial facade of the double crown, remains, 3,500 years later, genuinely unresolvable. Whether it was also a personal relationship, whether the young king and his formidable half-sister shared any bond of affection or mutual respect, is a question that the sources do not answer and that the archaeological record cannot resolve. What the sources do tell us is that the marriage produced at least one daughter, Neferu, and that Hatshepsut held the title of Great Royal Wife throughout her husband's reign, a title that carried not just ceremonial prestige but genuine political authority. The Egypt that Thutmose II inherited was an Egypt at the height of its post-liberation energy, an Egypt that had been transformed, in barely 2 generations, from a divided and humiliated kingdom into the most powerful state in the ancient world. The liberation from the Hyksos, accomplished by Ahmose I, had unleashed a wave of military, administrative, and cultural dynamism that showed no signs of abating. The professional army that the wars of liberation had created was the most formidable military force in the Bronze Age Near East. Equipped with chariot technology adopted from the Hyksos, armed with composite bows and bronze weapons, organized into named divisions, and commanded by a professional officer corps whose members had earned their commissions through demonstrated ability rather than hereditary privilege. The administrative apparatus that sustained this military machine was equally impressive. A centralized bureaucracy managed by 2 viziers, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt, that collected taxes, administered justice, managed the royal estates, and coordinated the enormous logistical effort required to maintain a standing army and to project military power across territories stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates. The religious establishment that legitimized the entire system was centered on the cult of Amun at Karnak, the god who had sustained the Theban kings during the Hyksos period and who had been elevated under the new kingdom to the position of supreme deity in the Egyptian pantheon. The temple of Amun at Karnak was already, by the time of Thutmose II's accession, the largest and most wealthy religious institution in Egypt, a sprawling complex of shrines, courts, storerooms, and administrative offices that functioned as a kind of parallel government, commanding vast agricultural estates, employing thousands of priests and support staff, and accumulating wealth that would eventually rival that of the pharaoh himself. The relationship between the pharaoh and the priesthood of Amun was the central political relationship of the new kingdom, a relationship of mutual dependence that could become, under the wrong circumstances, a relationship of mutual suspicion and even open conflict, as the religious revolution of Akhenaten would later demonstrate. The international environment that Thutmose II inherited was equally complex. The kingdom of Mitanni, the Hurrian state that controlled the upper Euphrates valley, and that had been Egypt's principal rival in the Levant since the campaigns of Thutmose I, remained a formidable power whose interests clashed with Egypt's across the entire northern sphere of influence. The Levantine city-states that his father had brought under Egyptian suzerainty, the vassal rulers who paid tribute, hosted Egyptian garrisons, and pledged loyalty to the pharaoh in exchange for military protection, were inherently unstable, prone to switching allegiances when they perceived weakness in the central authority, and requiring constant attention to maintain in anything resembling compliance. The Nubian territories that had been conquered and garrisoned under Thutmose I required ongoing military presence, ongoing administrative management, and ongoing expenditure of resources that strained the capacity of the Egyptian state. The frontier with the kingdom of Kerma, the Nubian power that had been pushed south but not destroyed, remained a potential flashpoint that required vigilance and occasional military action. The entire vast, complex, resource-hungry imperial structure that Thutmose I had built through military genius and relentless ambition was, in effect, a machine that required constant tending, a machine that would run as long as a competent operator sat at the controls, and that would begin to malfunction the moment the controls were abandoned or mishandled. Thutmose II inherited all of this. The army, the bureaucracy, the priesthood, the empire, the complex web of diplomatic relationships that connected Egypt to the other great powers of the Near East. He inherited it as a young man, perhaps a teenager, who owed his position on the throne not to any personal achievement, but to the accidents of birth and death that had made him the surviving male, heir of his father. He was not, by any reckoning, the son that the dynasty would have chosen. The succession question was further complicated by the deaths that had thinned the male line of the dynasty. His older brothers, Ahmose and Wajmose, sons of Thutmose I by his principal wife, Ahmose, had died before their father, leaving the throne to the son of the secondary wife. The dynasty's preferred heir was Hatshepsut, the daughter of the great royal wife, the woman who carried the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. But the Egyptian theological system, for all its flexibility in other respects, had never accommodated the idea of a female pharaoh. The solution, the marriage of Thutmose II to Hatshepsut, was a compromise that satisfied the theological requirements while creating a political dynamic that would, in the end, consume Thutmose II's legacy. The question of how long Thutmose II actually ruled is one of the most debated issues in the chronology of the 18th Dynasty. Estimates range from as few as 3 years to as many as 13 or 14, depending on which evidence is given priority and how certain ambiguous inscriptions are interpreted. The Egyptologist Kara Cooney, in her study of Hatshepsut, has argued for a very short reign of approximately 3 years, a reign so brief that Thutmose II would have had little time to accomplish anything of lasting significance. The question matters enormously for the interpretation of the tomb discovery. If Thutmose II ruled for 13 years, he had more than enough time to plan, commission, and supervise the construction of the tomb that Litherland found in the Wadi Gabanad el-Qurud, a tomb whose architectural design, while simple, reflects careful planning and competent execution. If he ruled for only 3 years, the tomb may have been planned but incomplete at the time of his death, finished hastily by Hatshepsut and the court officials who managed the transition of power. The question of whether the tomb was the product of the king's own planning or of his widow's posthumous efforts is directly relevant to our assessment of Thutmose II's agency. His capacity to act as an independent ruler rather than as a passive figure controlled by the people around him. Other scholars, including the chronologist Jürgen von Beckerath, have argued for a longer reign of approximately 13 years. Long enough for a pharaoh to have conducted military campaigns, built monuments, and left a meaningful mark on the historical record. The debate is not merely academic. The length of Thutmose II's reign determines how we understand his historical significance, whether he was a pharaoh in his own right, with his own policies and his own achievements, or merely a placeholder between his father and his wife, a transitional figure whose brief time on the throne left no lasting impression. The evidence for the shorter reign is circumstantial but suggestive. Few monuments can be attributed to Thutmose II with certainty. The physical evidence for his reign is frustratingly thin. His building program was modest: a limestone gateway at Karnak, contributions to the temple at Elephantine, some work at Semna and Kumma in Nubia. The question of what Thutmose II actually did during his reign, whether that reign lasted 3 years or 13, is complicated by the fact that the sources we have are limited, ambiguous, and potentially contaminated by the later manipulations of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. The evidence, such as it is, comes from a handful of inscriptions and administrative records that have survived the millennia of neglect and deliberate alteration. A stela from Aswan records a Nubian rebellion that was suppressed during Thutmose II's reign, a military operation that was commanded by the pharaoh's generals rather than by the pharaoh himself, a detail that has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of Thutmose II's physical weakness or military inexperience, and by others as a perfectly normal administrative delegation of the kind that pharaohs routinely practiced. A fragment of a campaign text mentions operations against the Shasu Bedouin of the Sinai, nomadic raiders who were a persistent nuisance on the northeastern frontier, and whose suppression was a routine military obligation for every pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. There may have been a campaign in Syria, though the evidence for this is uncertain and contested. His military record, while not empty, inscriptions credit him with suppressing rebellions in Nubia and defeating Bedouin tribes called the Shasu in the Sinai, is thin compared to those of his father and his son. The mummy attributed to Thutmose II, if it is indeed his, provides some physical evidence about the man himself. The body, as examined by the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in the late 19th century, appeared to be that of a young man in poor health. Maspero described the skin as covered with scabious patches, a dermatological condition that has been variously interpreted by modern medical researchers as an allergic reaction, a parasitic infection, or possibly the symptoms of a systemic disease. The body was thin, the limbs were slender, and the overall impression was of a man whose physical constitution was not robust, a man who did not possess the vigorous health that the pharaonic ideal demanded, and that the temple reliefs, with their idealized depictions of the pharaoh as a muscular warrior smiting the enemies of Egypt, so insistently portrayed. Whether these observations reflect a genuine chronic illness, one that might have shortened Thutmose II's life and contributed to the early end of his reign, or are simply artifacts of the mummification process and the subsequent millennia of deterioration, is a question that modern medical imaging technology might answer, but that has not yet been definitively resolved, and the manner of his death, which appears to have been sudden, leaving a very young son as his heir, suggests a man who died before his time, before he could complete whatever plans he had for his reign. But here is the problem. The evidence for Thutmose II's insignificance may itself be a product of what happened after his death, because the person who controlled the historical record after Thutmose II died was Hatshepsut, his wife, his half-sister, the woman who would, within a few years of his death, make herself pharaoh, and Hatshepsut had every reason to minimize the achievements of the husband she had replaced. The problem of attribution is compounded by the physical manipulation of the monuments themselves. Some of Thutmose II's monuments were altered after his death, His name replaced by Hatshepsut's in certain inscriptions, his images reworked to represent either Hatshepsut herself or her father, Thutmose I. This was not unusual in Egyptian practice. The alteration of monuments by later rulers was a common phenomenon that occurred throughout pharaonic history. But the specific pattern of alterations in Thutmose II's case suggested a deliberate effort to diminish his visibility in the historical record. The alterations were not random. They were targeted, focused on the most prominent monuments, the most visible inscriptions, the most public spaces where the king's name and image would have been seen by the largest number of people. The effect was to gradually erase Thutmose II from the public memory of his reign, to replace his presence in the monumental landscape with the presence of Hatshepsut or her father, so that a visitor to Karnak or any other major temple would see their names and their images where his had once been. His name replaced by Hatshepsut's in certain inscriptions, his images reworked to represent either Hatshepsut herself or her father, Thutmose I. The gateway at Karnak that is attributed to Thutmose II's reign shows both the king and his queen in relief scenes, but the queen's images are prominent, assertive, and positioned with a visual authority that suggests a woman who was already, during her husband's lifetime, exercising a degree of influence that went far beyond the conventional ceremonial role of the great royal wife. In some of the relief scenes, Hatshepsut appears alone, performing rituals, making offerings to the gods, acting in a capacity that would normally be reserved for the pharaoh himself. The implication is clear. The boundaries between the king's authority and the queen's were blurred during Thutmose II's reign, either because the king was too weak or too ill to exercise full royal authority, or because the queen was too capable and too ambitious to be confined to a purely ceremonial role. The images are telling not in what they show but in what they imply about the balance of authority between the king and the queen. The gateway at Karnak is a snapshot of a power relationship in flux, a relationship in which the balance between husband and wife, king and queen, was shifting in ways that the conventional categories of Egyptian kingship could not fully accommodate, and suggest a woman who was already exercising a degree of authority that went beyond the conventional role of the great royal wife. The Egyptologist Aidan Dodson, who has studied the succession politics of the 18th Dynasty extensively, has noted that the historical record of Thutmose II's brief and poorly documented reign is so thoroughly intertwined with the later activities of Hatshepsut that it is extremely difficult to determine which achievements belong to the king and which were later attributed to or appropriated by his successor. This interweaving of identities, the blurring of the line between Thutmose II's reign and Hatshepsut's, is itself a form of historical erasure. The actual living man, who actually sat on the physical throne of Egypt, who actually made decisions, who actually governed Egypt during the years of his reign, has been subsumed into the narratives of the more famous figures who surrounded him. He is visible only in the gaps, in the spaces between his father's achievements and his wife's ambitions, in the silences that the sources preserve where his voice should be. The mummy that has traditionally been identified as Thutmose II adds another layer of complexity to the story. The body was found in the Great Royal Cache at Deir el-Bahari in 1881, the same cache that yielded the mummies of Seqenenre-Tau, Ahmose I, Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Seti I, Rameses II, and dozens of other royal dead. The mummy was identified on the basis of a label on its wrappings that read Akheperenra, a partial rendering of Thutmose II's throne name, Akheperenra. The identification was accepted for more than a century. But Litherland, the discoverer of the tomb, has raised questions about it, noting that the mummy appears to be that of a man of approximately 30 years of age at the time of death, which he argues is too old for Thutmose II, who may have died in his early 20s or even younger. The age discrepancy is significant because the length of Thutmose II's reign, whether 3 years or 13, determines how old he would have been at death. If he ruled for only 3 years after succeeding his father at a young age, he might have died in his mid to late teens. far too young to match the mummy of a 30-year-old man. If he ruled for 13 years, the mummy's age becomes more plausible, but still requires assumptions about his age at accession that are not fully supported by the evidence. The debate about the mummy mirrors the debate about the reign. Both are characterized by a scarcity of evidence that makes confident conclusions impossible, and that has allowed scholars to construct competing narratives that differ dramatically in their assessment of Thutmose II's significance. The examination of the mummy itself provides additional information that complicates the picture. The body shows signs of a skin condition, possibly a papular dermatitis or an allergic reaction, that has led some medical researchers to speculate about chronic illness. The mummy is also notably thin, suggesting either a chronic disease that caused wasting or a period of illness before death. If Thutmose II died of a chronic illness rather than a sudden accident or battle wound, it might explain the abruptness of his death from a political perspective. A young king, weakened by disease, dying before he could consolidate his power, leaving a child heir and a formidable queen regent who would use the opportunity to reshape the political landscape in her own favour. But this interpretation is speculative. The mummy's condition could also be the result of the mummification process, or of damage sustained during the centuries between the pharaoh's death and the discovery of his body in the royal cache. If the identification is wrong, if the mummy in the Cairo Museum is not Thutmose II, then the pharaoh's actual mortal body, the physical remains of the fourth pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty, may still be waiting to be found somewhere in the western Wadis, in a tomb that the desert has been protecting for 3,500 years, perhaps in the second tomb that Litherland believes lies hidden beneath a mound of rubble near the first. The central problem of Thutmose II's reign, the problem that has made him invisible to history, and that makes the 2025 discovery so significant, is the problem of being overshadowed. He stands between giants. His father, Thutmose I, was the man who invented Egyptian imperialism, who marched to the Euphrates, who pushed the Nubian frontier to the Fourth Cataract, who transformed Egypt from a Nile Valley kingdom into a world empire. His wife, Hatshepsut, was the most powerful woman in the ancient world, a queen who made herself pharaoh, who ruled Egypt for approximately 22 years, who built one of the most beautiful temples in Egyptian history at Deir el-Bahari, and who conducted the famous and widely celebrated trading expedition to the distant and exotic land of Punt. His son, Thutmose III, was the Napoleon of Egypt, the warrior pharaoh who fought 17 campaigns in the Levant, who won the famous Battle of Megiddo, who expanded the Egyptian empire to its greatest territorial extent, and who is considered by many scholars to be the greatest military commander of the ancient world. Between these towering figures, Thutmose II disappears. Not because he was incompetent, the evidence does not support that conclusion. Not because he was a bad ruler. The inscriptions that survive from his reign describe a pharaoh who maintained the empire his father had built, who suppressed rebellions in Nubia, who defended the northeastern frontier against the Shasu Bedouin, and who continued the building programs that were the visible expression of pharaonic power. He disappears because the scale of the achievements that surrounded him, the achievements of his father, his wife, and his son, made his own contributions seem negligible by comparison. He is the pharaoh who did not march to the Euphrates, who did not build Deir el-Bahari, who did not fight the Battle of Megiddo. He is defined not by what he did, but by what others did before and after him. He is the negative space in the portrait of a dynasty, the empty frame hanging between the masterworks, the unmarked grave in a cemetery of monuments. The 18th Dynasty is the most studied, the most celebrated, and the most thoroughly documented dynasty in Egyptian history. Its pharaohs have been the subjects of countless books, documentaries, exhibitions, and scholarly studies. Its monuments, Karnak, Luxor, Deir el-Bahari, the Valley of the Kings, Abu Simbel, are among the most visited and most photographed archaeological sites in the world. Its artifacts, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the painted busts of Nefertiti, the colossal statues of Ramesses, are among the most iconic objects in the history of human art. And yet, at the center of this extraordinary dynasty, there is a gap shaped like a pharaoh, a gap that the 2025 discovery has begun, for the first time in the modern archaeological study of ancient Egypt, to fill. The filling of that gap is not merely a matter of adding a new tomb to the catalogue. It is a matter of restoring a human being to the narrative of one of the most important dynasties in the history of human civilization. A narrative that had, until February of 2025, been told as though one of its central characters, the fourth pharaoh of the dynasty, the husband of Hatshepsut, the father of Thutmose III, either did not exist or did not matter. The outline of a man visible only because the figures around him are painted in such vivid colours. This is the fate that the 2025 discovery challenges, because the tomb in the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud tells us something that the literary and inscriptional sources do not, something that the later manipulations of Hatshepsut and the subsequent centuries of neglect have concealed. It tells us that Thutmose II was buried as a king, that his burial was prepared with the full apparatus of royal funerary ritual, the amduat on the walls, the alabaster vessels inscribed with his name, the sacred texts that were reserved exclusively for the burials of pharaohs, that Hatshepsut herself, the woman who would replace him on the throne, supervised his burial, as the inscription on one of the alabaster jars makes clear. It was Hatshepsut who had Thutmose II buried in this location. This detail is striking and potentially revelatory. Hatshepsut buried her husband. She did not neglect him. She did not dishonor him. She did not, at least at the time of his death, treat him as the insignificant non-entity that later history would make of him. She gave him a royal burial in a tomb that was prepared according to the highest standards of pharaonic funerary practice. The inscription is also significant because it demonstrates that Hatshepsut, at the time of Thutmose II's death, was still identifying herself as his wife, as the great royal wife of a dead king, not as a king in her own right. Her transition from queen to pharaoh had not yet begun. The woman who buried Thutmose II was still, in her own self-presentation, a queen, a wife fulfilling her duty to her deceased husband, ensuring that the man she had married was properly equipped for the afterlife, the ambition that would drive her to seize the throne, the ambition that would make her one of the most famous rulers in the history of the ancient world, was either not yet formed or not yet publicly expressed. The burial was an act of conventional piety, the queen doing what queens were expected to do, and this conventional beginning makes the unconventional sequel all the more remarkable. Whatever happened afterward, whatever alterations she made to his monuments, whatever claims she advanced for her own legitimacy at his expense, the initial act was one of respect. The wife buried the husband with honor. The queen buried the king according to the rituals that the gods demanded. And this tells us that the relationship between Thutmose II and Hatshepsut was more complex than the simple narrative of a weak husband dominated by a powerful wife would suggest. The implications of this detail extend beyond the personal relationship between Thutmose and Hatshepsut. They touch on the nature of the succession itself, on the question of how Hatshepsut came to power and what her intentions were in the years immediately following her husband's death. The conventional narrative, the narrative that most Egyptology textbooks present, is that Hatshepsut served as regent for the young Thutmose III, who was perhaps 2 or 3 years old at the time of his father's death, an infant by any reasonable standard too young to rule, requiring a regent who would govern in his name until he reached maturity. The regent was Hatshepsut, Thutmose II's wife, the child's stepmother, the most powerful woman in Egypt, and perhaps the most powerful woman in the ancient world. The political situation was explosive. A child king, a formidable regent, an empire that required constant military and administrative attention, and a theological system that had no precedent for what was about to happen. Within 7 years, the regent would make herself king. The child, Thutmose III, who would eventually become perhaps the greatest warrior pharaoh in all of Egyptian history, would be sidelined, reduced to a nominal co-ruler while his stepmother exercised actual power, and the memory of Thutmose II, the man whose death had created this unprecedented situation, would begin its long slide into obscurity, and that she gradually accumulated power over the first 7 years of the new king's reign until she had herself crowned as pharaoh, adopting the full royal titulary and ruling as a king in her own right for approximately 15 more years. This narrative presents Hatshepsut's assumption of power as a gradual process, a slow escalation from regent to co-regent to dominant king that unfolded over several years. But the evidence from the tomb suggests a different possibility. If Hatshepsut supervised the burial of Thutmose II with the full honours of kingship, if she ensured that his tomb was decorated with the amduat and furnished with royal funerary equipment, then her relationship with the dead king was not one of simple political rivalry. It was more complex. A relationship in which respect for the dead husband coexisted with ambition for the throne he had vacated, in which the obligations of the great royal wife coexisted with the aspirations of the would-be pharaoh, in which the woman who would erase her husband's name from his own monuments first ensured that his body was properly prepared for eternity. This complexity, this coexistence of honour and ambition, of duty and desire, is far more interesting than the simple narrative of a power-hungry woman displacing a weak husband. It is the complexity of a real human relationship, messy, contradictory, containing within itself both the impulse to honour and the impulse to appropriate, both the grief of a wife and the ambition of a queen, both the duty to the dead and the opportunity created by his death, playing out against the backdrop of one of the most consequential political transitions in the history of the ancient world. The tomb itself tells a story of its own, a story of catastrophe and rescue. The burial chamber, located at the end of a corridor approximately 29 meters long, measures roughly 5 by 5 meters and stands approximately 3.5 meters high. It was decorated with blue-painted inscriptions and yellow stars, the celestial imagery that was standard in royal tombs of the 18th Dynasty, and with passages from the Book of the Amduat, the funerary text that described the pharaoh's journey through the underworld during the 12 hours of the night. The decoration, in its surviving fragments, closely resembles the decoration of the tomb of Thutmose III in the Valley of the Kings, suggesting that the son's tomb may have been modelled on the father's, or that both followed a common template that was standard in the early 18th Dynasty. But within approximately 6 years of Thutmose II's burial, disaster struck. A flash flood, the kind of sudden, catastrophic, terrifyingly violent deluge that can transform a dry desert wadi into a raging torrent of water, mud, and debris within minutes, carrying rocks and boulders the size of oxen and larger, and moving with a force that can sweep away entire settlements, poured into the tomb. The water inundated the burial chamber, damaging the painted walls, destroying fragile objects, and depositing a thick layer of silt and debris that covered everything the flood did not sweep away. The geology of the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud helps explain the catastrophe. The wadi is located beneath 2 waterfalls, natural drainage channels that funnel rainwater from the cliffs above down into the valley below. In the drier climate of the modern era, significant rainfall in the Theban hills is rare, but in the mid-15th century BC, the climate of the Eastern Sahara was wetter than it is today. Not dramatically wetter, but enough to produce occasional rainstorms that could generate flash floods of devastating power. Piers Litherland himself noted that the tomb was situated in a poorly chosen place beneath 2 waterfalls and at the bottom of a slope down which water would have, and did, pour in the much wetter weather of the 18th Dynasty. The implication is startling. The people who chose this location for the pharaoh's tomb may not have understood the flood risk, may not have recognized, in the dry season when the site was selected and the tomb was cut, that the wadi could become a death trap during the brief violent rainstorms that visited the Theban hills every few years. The team, led by the geoarchaeologist Judith Bunbury of Cambridge University, studied the sediment deposits within the tomb and concluded that the flooding occurred within approximately 6 years of the burial. Sediment lines on the tomb walls show that the water reached shoulder height, a devastating amount of water in a confined space, more than enough to destroy papyrus, textiles, wooden objects, and anything else that was not made of stone. The flood was so severe that the ceiling of the burial chamber eventually collapsed under the weight of the water-saturated rock above, filling the chamber with rubble and making it inaccessible. The priests who were responsible for the maintenance of the royal burial did not abandon Thutmose II to the floodwaters. They returned to the tomb, opened it, and rescued what they could, including, almost certainly, the pharaoh's mummy. The body was relocated, moved to another burial site, possibly the second tomb that Litherland believes he has identified nearby, and eventually to the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, where the mummy labelled Akhhepenre was found in 1881. The funerary furniture, the sarcophagus, the canopic equipment, the shabtis, the personal possessions of the dead king, was either salvaged and moved with the body or lost to the floodwaters. Of all the objects that would have accompanied a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty into eternity, only the alabaster jar fragments survive, the first funerary objects of Thutmose II ever found, the first tangible physical evidence, apart from the much-disputed mummy in the Cairo Museum, of the mortal remains of a pharaoh who had been, until that moment, a ghost in the historical record. And it gets worse, or rather, it gets more tantalizing, because Litherland's team believes they have identified the location of a second tomb. A tomb that may have been the relocation site for Thutmose II's burial after the flood destroyed the first. The evidence is a massive mound of rubble, approximately 23 meters of deliberately layered fill, that sits above a point in the landscape where geological and archaeological evidence suggests a second chamber may be concealed. The possibility of a second tomb, a tomb that might contain the pharaoh's sarcophagus, his canopic jars, his shabtis, and the other funerary objects that would have accompanied him into eternity, is electrifying. No pharaoh's tomb has been found intact since Tutankhamun's in 1922. The discovery of an undisturbed royal burial, with its contents in place, its seals unbroken, its treasures untouched by the tomb robbers who plundered virtually every other royal burial in the Theban necropolis, would be an event of incalculable archaeological significance. The archaeologist Mohsen Kamel, a veteran of the excavation, was quoted in The Guardian as saying, "The possible existence of a second, and most likely intact, tomb of Thutmose II is an astonishing possibility." Litherland told The Observer, "There are 23 meters of a pile of man-made layers sitting above a point in the landscape where we believe, and we have other confirmatory evidence, there is a monument concealed beneath." The phrase man-made layers is significant. It suggests that the rubble covering the potential second tomb was not deposited naturally, but was deliberately placed there, possibly as a concealment measure by the ancient priests who relocated the pharaoh's burial after the flood. If the layers are man-made, they imply intentionality, the deliberate hiding of a tomb by people who wanted it to remain hidden, protected from the tomb robbers whose depredations were already, by the late New Kingdom, a serious problem for the royal burials. If the second tomb exists, and if it is indeed intact, it could contain the sarcophagus, the canopic equipment, and the funerary objects of a pharaoh whose material record has been virtually blank for 3,500 years. The potential significance of such a discovery is difficult to overstate. It would be the most important royal tomb discovery since Tutankhamun. Not in terms of the golden treasures that Carter found in 1922, but in terms of the historical information that an undisturbed burial could provide about a pharaoh whose life and reign have been almost completely lost to history. The tomb also provides the first physical evidence of the funerary preparations for a pharaoh of the early 18th Dynasty, evidence that is invaluable for understanding the development of royal burial practices during this critical period. The fragments of the Amduat, the sacred funerary text that describes the pharaoh's nocturnal journey through the underworld, represent the earliest known version of this text from a royal tomb. The Amduat would become, in the later 18th dynasty and beyond, the most important funerary text in the Egyptian royal repertoire, decorating the walls of the tombs of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and their successors in the Valley of the Kings, with increasingly elaborate and increasingly standardized versions of the text. The fragments from Thutmose II's tomb show the Amduat in its early form, written in cursive hieroglyphs, painted in blue pigment on a white plaster background, closely resembling the later version found in the tomb of Thutmose III, but with differences that may reflect an earlier stage of the text's development. These fragments are of enormous value to scholars of Egyptian religion and funerary practice. They provide a window onto a period of theological development that was previously known only from later, more elaborate versions of the same texts. The architectural layout of the tomb is also significant. The corridor, approximately 29 meters long, leads to a burial chamber that sits 1.4 meters higher than the corridor floor. Litherland has suggested that this height difference was deliberate, designed to facilitate the movement of the tomb's contents after the flooding, when the priests needed to remove the pharaoh's body and whatever salvageable funerary equipment remained. Litherland noted that the decorative scheme of the tomb closely resembles what is found in the tomb of Thutmose III, tomb Kivi 34 in the Valley of the Kings, suggesting that the son may have modelled his tomb on his father's, or that both followed a common design template that was standard for royal burials of the early 18th Dynasty. The resemblance is significant because it establishes a direct link between the first known royal tomb outside the Valley of the Kings and the first major royal tomb inside it. A link that suggests the continuity of funerary traditions across the transition from the Western Wadis to the Valley of the Kings. The simple, functional design of the tomb, lacking the elaborate decorative programs and the complex multi-chambered layouts of later royal tombs, may represent a transitional stage in the development of new kingdom tomb architecture. The tomb of Thutmose II may have been, in Litherland's words, a prototype for the more elaborate royal tombs that followed, an early experiment in the kind of rock-cut tomb design that would reach its full expression in the great tombs of the Valley of the Kings. But here is what makes this truly terrifying from the perspective of archaeological method and historical interpretation. The discovery of the tomb forces us to confront a question that Egyptology has been reluctant to ask. How much of what we think we know about the 18th dynasty is actually true? How much of the historical record of this period, the record that tells us Thutmose II was a weak, insignificant king overshadowed by his wife, is based on evidence, and how much is based on the narratives constructed by the people who came after him? Hatshepsut had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to reshape the historical record of her husband's reign, to minimize his achievements, to appropriate his monuments, to present her own ascent to power as the natural consequence of his inadequacy. Thutmose III, who was technically Thutmose II's son and successor, but who had spent the first 22 years of his reign in the shadow of his stepmother Hatshepsut, and who spent the latter part of his reign systematically erasing her image and her name from the monuments of Egypt, had his own reasons for distorting the record. Reasons that may have included the suppression of his father's memory as well as his stepmother's. The historical record of Thutmose II's reign is not a transparent window onto the past. It is a palimpsest, a text that has been written, erased, and rewritten by successive generations, each with its own agenda, each leaving its own marks and its own distortions on the surface of the stone. The challenge for the modern Egyptologist is to read through these layers, to peel back the alterations, the appropriations, the erasures, and the fabrications that have accumulated over 3 millennia, and to reconstruct, however imperfectly, the original text beneath. The tomb of Thutmose II offers a rare opportunity to do this, because the tomb, unlike the literary and inscriptional sources, has not been through the hands of later editors. It was sealed by the flood, preserved by the desert, and opened, for the first time in 35 centuries, by a team of archaeologists who had no agenda other than the recovery of the truth. The tomb discovery does not resolve these distortions. It does not tell us definitively how long Thutmose II reigned, or what he accomplished during his reign, or how he died, or what kind of man he was, what drove him, what he feared, what he hoped for. But it does something equally important. It provides a fixed point, an archaeological datum that exists outside the manipulated literary record, and that gives us something solid to hold on to as we navigate the shifting, unreliable, politically contaminated textual evidence. The tomb is real, the alabaster inscriptions are real, the amduat fragments are real, the flood damage is real. These are facts that were created at the moment of the burial and that have remained unchanged for 3,500 years. They were not written by a scribe serving a later pharaoh. They were not carved by a craftsman working under orders to alter the record. They were not selected, edited, or manipulated by anyone with a political agenda. They are the raw data of the past, the unmediated testimony of a moment in time that has been preserved by the indifference of the desert and the violence of the flood that paradoxically sealed the evidence against further disturbance. These are facts that no later pharaoh altered, no ambitious queen appropriated, and no royal scribe rewrote. They are the testimony of the desert, and the desert, unlike the scribes of the 18th Dynasty, has no political agenda. The discovery also has implications for our understanding of the relationship between Hatshepsut and the early pharaohs of the 18th Dynasty. The fact that she supervised her husband's burial, that she ensured he was interred according to the full protocol of royal funerary practice, suggests that her initial relationship with the Thutmose dynasty was one of respect and duty rather than rivalry and ambition. The Hatshepsut who buried Thutmose II was not yet the Hatshepsut who would claim the throne for herself. She was a queen, a great royal wife, performing the duties that her position required. The transformation from wife to pharaoh, from the woman who buried the king to the woman who replaced him, was a process that unfolded over years, driven by circumstances, opportunities, and ambitions that we can only partially reconstruct from the surviving evidence. The tomb provides the starting point of that process, the moment of conventional piety from which the unconventional trajectory of Hatshepsut's career would later diverge. The discovery also raises the possibility, tantalizing, unprovable, but impossible to dismiss, that the conventional assessment of Thutmose II as a weak and insignificant ruler is itself a product of the political distortions that have shaped the historical record. If Hatshepsut had a reason to minimize her husband's achievements, if her claim to the throne depended, in part, on presenting his reign as inadequate and his person as insufficient, then the scarcity of evidence for his accomplishments may not reflect the reality of his rule. It may reflect the effectiveness of the erasure. A pharaoh who was truly insignificant would not need to be erased. The silence of the historical record is not innocent. The silence itself is evidence. Evidence that someone, at some point, decided that Thutmose II's achievements were not worth recording, or that the records that did exist were not worth preserving, or that the monuments that bore his name were more useful bearing someone else's. The very fact that his memory was manipulated suggests that there was something worth manipulating, some achievement, some legacy, some claim to legitimacy that Hatshepsut needed to suppress in order to justify her own unprecedented assumption of royal power. The tomb in the Wadi will not answer this question directly, but the second tomb, if it exists, if it is found, if it contains the kind of evidence that only an undisturbed burial can provide, might. The story of Thutmose II, the pharaoh who disappeared from history and was recovered 35 centuries later through the patient work of archaeology, is a story that has parallels across the entire span of historical scholarship. The problem of the forgotten ruler, the overlooked figure, the person whose contributions were erased or minimized by the people who came after. This is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is a universal problem, inherent in the nature of historical memory itself, and the cases that illuminate it most vividly are the cases in which the forgotten figure is recovered, and the recovery forces a reassessment of everything that was believed before. Let us begin with the most direct parallel to Thutmose II's situation, the case of another ruler who was overshadowed by a more famous spouse, and whose historical reputation suffered accordingly. King Philip II of Spain, who ruled one of the largest empires in human history from 1556 to 1598, was married to 4 wives, one of whom, Mary I of England, was so famous and so controversial that her story has dominated the historical narrative of their shared reign. Philip's relationship with Mary, the political calculations, the religious tensions, the failed attempt to produce an heir, has been told and retold by historians and dramatists for centuries. But Philip himself, the man who governed Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, the Philippines, and vast territories in the Americas, has often been reduced, in popular accounts, to a supporting character in his wife's story. The parallel with Thutmose II is suggestive. In both cases, the historical reputation of the ruler has been distorted by the gravitational pull of a more famous spouse. Philip, like Thutmose, was a competent and in many respects impressive ruler whose achievements have been obscured by the dramatic narrative that surrounds his more famous partner. But the comparison also has its limits. Philip ruled for more than 40 years and left a substantial documentary record. Thutmose ruled for at most 13 years and left almost none. The degree of erasure is different. Philip has been understudied but not forgotten, while Thutmose has been virtually absent from the historical consciousness for millennia. In both cases, the fame of the spouse obscured the achievements of the ruler, creating a distorted historical record in which the less famous partner appears as a cipher rather than a person. But a more instructive parallel comes from within Egyptology itself. The case of Hatshepsut's own erasure from the historical record. For centuries after her death, Hatshepsut was virtually unknown, her images destroyed, her inscriptions defaced, her name removed from the official king lists that Egyptian scribes compiled as the canonical record of royal succession. The erasure was so thorough that when 19th century Egyptologists first encountered her monuments at Deir el-Bahari, they assumed the female pharaoh depicted on the walls was a man, a king named Hatshepsut, whose body had been depicted with feminine features due to some artistic convention they did not understand. The story of Hatshepsut's erasure and recovery is one of the great narratives of archaeological detective work. The initial clue came from the monuments themselves. The carved relief scenes at Deir el-Bahari that showed a pharaoh wearing the regalia of kingship, but with a body that appeared, in certain subtle anatomical details, to be female. The early Egyptologists, men like Carl Richard Lepsius, Auguste Mariette, and Gaston Maspero, struggled with these images, unable to reconcile the evidence of a female body with the assumption that all pharaohs were male. The solution came slowly, through decades of research, the identification of Hatshepsut's cartouches, the translation of her inscriptions, the reconstruction of her relationship with Thutmose III, the analysis of the erasure campaign that had removed her images and her names from the monuments of Egypt, the gradual recovery of Hatshepsut's identity, the recognition that she was not a misrepresented male king, but an actual female pharaoh who had ruled Egypt in her own right, is one of the great detective stories of Egyptology. It took decades of scholarship, multiple generations of researchers, and the patient, sometimes tedious, often frustrating accumulation of evidence from dozens of sites across Egypt, from Karnak to Deir el-Bahari, to Beni Hassan, to the quarries of Aswan, to the fortresses of Nubia, to reconstruct the career of a woman whose successors had tried to erase her from history. The lesson of Hatshepsut's recovery is directly relevant to the story of Thutmose II. If the most powerful woman in the ancient world could be erased from history, if a pharaoh who ruled for 22 years, who built one of the most beautiful temples in Egypt, who conducted a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, could be so thoroughly forgotten that her very existence was disputed by modern scholars, then how much more easily could a less prominent figure disappear? Thutmose II did not build a temple as magnificent as Deir el-Bahari. He did not conduct a trading expedition as famous as the voyage to Punt. He did not rule for 22 years. He was a quieter presence, a more modest pharaoh, a man whose achievements were real but not spectacular, the kind of ruler who maintains a functioning state rather than transforming it, who keeps the wheels turning rather than redesigning the vehicle, who preserves an empire rather than expanding it, who does the unglamorous work of governance rather than the glorious work of conquest. And it is precisely this kind of ruler, the maintainer, the preserver, the quiet competent, the steady administrator, the reliable governor, who is most vulnerable to the distortions of historical memory. The brilliant and the terrible are remembered, the competent are forgotten. This is not just an ancient problem, it is a permanent feature of human cognition, a bias that affects the way we remember everything, from political leaders to colleagues to family members. The recovery of Hatshepsut's identity is one of the great intellectual achievements of 19th and 20th century Egyptology, and it is a story that provides a template for what the recovery of Thutmose II's identity might look like. When Hatshepsut was first identified, she was a curiosity, an anomaly, a puzzle that did not fit the existing framework of Egyptological understanding. It took decades of work, the identification of her monuments, the translation of her inscriptions, the analysis of her relationship with Thutmose III, the reconstruction of her 22-year reign, to build the comprehensive picture of her life and career that modern scholars possess. The recovery is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of justice, the restoration of a name and a legacy that were deliberately suppressed by people with the power to suppress them. The recovery of Hatshepsut showed that even the most thorough erasure cannot eliminate a historical figure completely, that the traces survive, in the stones that were recarved, in the inscriptions that were incompletely deleted, in the architectural evidence that reveals the original configuration beneath the alterations. The recovery of Thutmose II, though far less advanced, follows the same principle. The traces survive. In the alabaster fragments, in the Amduat texts, in the architectural layout of a tomb that the flood could damage but could not completely destroy, and that the patient, indifferent, all-preserving desert chose to preserve. The recovery of Thutmose II's identity is at its earliest stages. The tomb was only announced in 2025, and the full excavation and analysis of its contents will take years, possibly decades. But the template is there, the methodology is established, the questions are identified, and the desert which kept the tomb hidden for 35 centuries has shown that it has more to reveal. The phenomenon of the forgotten king is not limited to ancient Egypt. It appears across every civilization that has produced a historical record long enough and complex enough to allow certain figures to be overshadowed or suppressed. The phenomenon extends across cultures and across centuries. In English history, the reign of King Stephen, who ruled from 1135 to 1154, is so poorly documented and so thoroughly overshadowed by the reigns of his more famous predecessors and successors that the period is known as the Anarchy, as though the mere absence of a memorable king was equivalent to political chaos. In Chinese history, several emperors of the Western Han Dynasty, including Emperors Hui, Shao, Wen, and Jing, who governed China during the crucial early decades of the dynasty, men who governed one of the largest and most sophisticated states in the ancient world, are virtually unknown outside specialist scholarship, their achievements obscured by the towering reputations of the dynasty's founder, Liu Bang, and its most aggressive expansionist, Emperor Wu. In Japanese history, the Muromachi shogunate produced a succession of shoguns whose names are almost completely unfamiliar even to educated Japanese, overshadowed by the more dramatic figures of the Sengoku Warring States period and the Tokugawa era that followed it. In every civilization, the same pattern repeats. The maintainers fade into the background, while the builders and the destroyers occupy the foreground, and the historical record, which is, after all, a form of storytelling, subject to the same narrative biases that shape all human communication, systematically privileges the dramatic over the competent. The phenomenon extends beyond individual rulers to entire periods of history. The late Roman Republic, the century and a half between the Punic Wars and the rise of Augustus, produced dozens of consuls, praetors, and provincial governors whose names are virtually unknown to anyone outside specialist academic circles, despite the fact that these men governed one of the largest and most sophisticated states in the ancient world. They are overshadowed by the few figures who dominate the popular imagination: Caesar, Pompey, Cicero, Crassus, just as Thutmose II is overshadowed by Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. The pattern holds across civilizations and across millennia. A few figures capture the historical spotlight, and everyone else stands in their shadow. The fundamental question is whether this pattern reflects historical reality or systematically distorts it. Were the forgotten rulers genuinely less important than the remembered ones? Or is the forgetting itself a distortion, a product of the way historical memory works, which concentrates attention on the dramatic and the exceptional while ignoring the steady and the competent? The answer, as with so many questions in historiography, is almost certainly both. Some forgotten rulers were genuinely mediocre, men and women whose contributions to the civilizations they served were minimal and whose obscurity is deserved. But others were competent administrators whose achievements, while not dramatic, were essential to the functioning of the states they governed. The challenge, and it is a considerable one, for the historian and for the archaeologist, is to distinguish between the two, to identify the cases in which the forgetting is a genuine reflection of insignificance, and the cases in which it is a distortion produced by the biases of historical memory. The pattern is consistent. Historical memory is not democratic. It does not distribute attention equally among all participants. It concentrates attention on a few, the founders, the conquerors, the innovators, the catastrophically bad, and allows the rest to fade into the background. The pharaohs who are remembered are the pharaohs who did something extraordinary, who built the Great Pyramid, who unified Egypt, who drove out the Hyksos, who marched to the Euphrates, who made herself king, who fought the Battle of Megiddo, who built Abu Simbel. The pharaohs who are forgotten are the pharaohs who merely governed, who maintained the borders, who collected the taxes, who adjudicated the disputes, who kept the irrigation systems functioning and the granaries full and the army trained and the temples supplied with offerings. The work of maintenance is essential. Without it, the civilization collapses. The irrigation canals silt up. The granaries empty. The army loses its readiness. The frontiers weaken. The vassal states rebel. The temples fall into disrepair. The administrative correspondence piles up unanswered. The judicial system grinds to a halt. The tax collectors stop collecting. The officials stop reporting. And within a generation, sometimes within a few years, the entire edifice that took centuries to build begins to crumble. The collapse of the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, the third intermediate period. Every era of Egyptian fragmentation was preceded by a failure of maintenance, a period in which the routine work of governance was neglected, deferred, or disrupted. The pharaohs who prevented these failures, who kept the vast, intricate, easily disrupted machinery of empire running, who ensured that the canals were dredged and the granaries were stocked and the army was trained and the temples were supplied, are the unsung heroes of Egyptian civilization. They are the pharaohs who made the spectacular achievements of the builders and the conquerors possible. And they are the pharaohs whose names have been forgotten, but it is invisible as the air we breathe, as the ground beneath our feet, as the 10,000 daily acts of competent governance that sustain a civilization and that no one notices until they stop. The work of maintenance is, in many ways, harder and more demanding than the work of creation, because it requires the same level of competence, without the same level of recognition. The builder is celebrated because his work is visible, the temple rises, the army marches, the border expands. The maintainer is invisible because his work consists precisely in preventing things from changing, in keeping the temple standing, the army trained, the border secure. The builder transforms the world, the maintainer preserves the transformation. And in the hierarchy of historical fame, transformation always outranks preservation. Thutmose II was a maintainer. He inherited an empire, the empire that his father had built, and he maintained it. He suppressed rebellions in Nubia, the kind of stubborn, persistent, never fully resolved resistance that characterized the Egyptian occupation of Nubian territories throughout the New Kingdom. The same kind of rebellions that every pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty, from Ahmose through Thutmose III and beyond, had to suppress, because the Nubian population never fully accepted Egyptian rule and because the maintenance of the frontier required constant military vigilance. He defended the northeastern border against the Shasu, nomadic tribes that raided the Egyptian frontier settlements in the Sinai and the Negev, a persistent but manageable threat that required regular military operations to contain. He continued the building programs at Karnak and other temples, adding to the architectural legacy of the dynasty, maintaining the visible symbols of pharaonic power, ensuring that the gods were properly housed and properly worshipped. None of these achievements was spectacular. None of them would inspire epic poetry or triumphal inscriptions. All of them were necessary, and the fact that Thutmose II accomplished them, that the empire he inherited from his father was passed intact to his son, is itself a significant achievement, even if it is not the kind of achievement that inspires epic poetry or monumental inscriptions. The invisibility of the maintainer is not merely a historical phenomenon. It is a structural feature of human cognition, a bias built into the way we process information and construct narratives. Psychologists have documented what they call negativity bias, the tendency of the human mind to pay more attention to negative events than to positive ones, to remember threats more vividly than blessings, to focus on crises rather than on the steady state that exists between crises. This bias is adaptive. In the evolutionary environment, paying close attention to dangers was essential for survival, while the absence of danger required no special attention. But when applied to historical memory, the bias produces a systematic distortion, a record that emphasizes crises, conflicts, and dramatic changes, while ignoring the periods of stability, prosperity, and competent governance that separate them. The maintainer is invisible, not because his work is unimportant, but because the human mind is wired to notice the things that go wrong and to ignore the things that go right. The comparison with other maintaining rulers illuminates the essential nature of Thutmose II's contribution. The Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 AD, is one of the least known of the Roman emperors, precisely because his reign was stable, prosperous, and uneventful. He inherited an empire at the height of its power from his predecessor Hadrian, and he maintained it, governing competently, keeping the borders secure, managing the finances prudently, and passing the empire intact to his successor, Marcus Aurelius. The comparison with Antoninus Pius is particularly instructive because it illuminates the paradox of successful governance. Antoninus Pius's reign is generally considered one of the most prosperous and stable in the history of the Roman Empire. A 23-year period of peace, good administration, and fiscal prudence that represented the peak of what Gibbon called the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. And yet, Antoninus is barely remembered, precisely because his reign was so successful that it produced no crises, no wars, no dramatic events that would have given historians something to write about. The historian Edward Gibbon, in his famous survey of the Roman Empire, could find almost nothing to say about Antoninus Pius, not because the emperor was a failure, but because he was a success. Success, in governance, is boring. It does not generate the dramatic narratives that historians crave. It does not produce the crises, the conflicts, the turning points that make for compelling stories. It produces stability. And stability, however valuable to the people who live under it, however grateful the farmers and merchants and craftsmen and soldiers who depend on it for their daily bread and their physical safety, is, paradoxically but inevitably, the enemy of narrative interest. The historian who writes about Antoninus Pius faces the same challenge that the historian who writes about Thutmose II faces. How do you construct a compelling narrative about a reign in which nothing went wrong? How do you make a story out of stability? The answer, for most historians, is that you don't. You focus instead on the reigns that produced crises, conflicts, and dramatic events, and you allow the stable reigns to recede into the background, mentioned in passing as intervals of peace between the storms. The result is a historical record that systematically underrepresents competence and overrepresents crisis, a record that gives the misleading impression that the past was a continuous sequence of dramatic events, when in fact most of the past was spent in the unglamorous, unrecorded, essential state of normalcy that the maintainers sustained. Thutmose II was the Antoninus Pius of the 18th Dynasty, A pharaoh whose very success in maintaining the empire his father had built made him invisible to history. The empire did not expand under his rule, but it did not contract. The borders were not pushed forward, but they were not pushed back. The temples were not revolutionized, but they were maintained. The administration functioned. The army was ready. The gods were served. There is a thought experiment that illuminates the significance of the maintainer. Imagine if Thutmose II's reign had been a disaster. If the empire had contracted, if the Nubian frontier had collapsed, if the Levantine vassal states had rebelled, if the administration had failed and the army had disintegrated and the temples had fallen into disrepair, in that case, his brief reign would have been remembered with the sharpness and the bitterness that history reserves for its failures. The collapse of the Nubian frontier under Thutmose II, the rebellion of the Levantine vassal states during his reign, the administrative chaos of a government too weak to collect taxes or maintain order, the military defeats of an army too ill-prepared to defend the borders. These would have been the headlines of his reign, the dramatic, narrative-rich events that historians crave and that the chroniclers of the 18th Dynasty would have recorded with the same meticulous detail they devoted to the victories and the building programs of the more successful pharaohs. The fact that none of these disasters occurred, that the empire remained stable, that the frontiers held, that the administration functioned, is the evidence of competence, vividly, bitterly, as a cautionary tale of incompetence, a warning to future generations about the consequences of placing an inadequate man on the throne. The fact that none of these things happened, that the empire remained stable, that the frontiers held, that the administration functioned, that the army stayed ready, is itself the evidence of Thutmose II's competence. His achievement was the absence of failure, and the absence of failure, the prevention of crises, the maintenance of functioning systems, the quiet competence that ensures the machinery of civilization continues to operate, is the hardest kind of achievement to see, precisely because its success is measured by the things that do not happen. The Nubian frontier did not collapse. The Levantine vassal states did not rebel. The army did not lose its readiness. The administration did not fail. The temples were maintained. The gods were served. The people were fed. None of these negatives produces a dramatic narrative. All of them represent genuine accomplishments. Accomplishments that required skill, attention, energy, and the kind of competent daily effort that sustains a civilization, but that no one notices, because noticing is reserved for the things that go wrong, and the absence of failure is, in the paradoxical logic of historical memory, the surest route to being forgotten. Consider, too, the domestic politics of the period. Thutmose II governed Egypt at a time when the balance of power between the pharaoh and the priesthood of Amun was becoming increasingly important and increasingly delicate. The wealth and influence of the Amun priesthood were growing with each generation of new kingdom rule, as successive pharaohs endowed the temple with land, revenues, and privileges that made it an economic and political power in its own right. Managing this relationship, maintaining the pharaoh's authority while keeping the priesthood's support, required diplomatic skills of a high order. The fact that Thutmose II maintained this balance during his reign, that the priesthood did not rebel, that the temple continued to support the throne, that the delicate equilibrium between secular and religious authority was preserved, is another of his invisible achievements, another contribution that the historical record does not celebrate because it did not produce the kind of dramatic conflict that historians find interesting. And when he died, suddenly, unexpectedly, leaving a child on the throne and a formidable queen as regent, the kingdom he left behind was stable enough to survive the extraordinary political transformation that followed, the unprecedented ascent of Hatshepsut to the throne of the pharaohs. Hatshepsut's assumption of power, her transformation from regent to co-regent to dominant king over a period of approximately 7 years, was the single most radical and most disruptive political event of the entire 18th dynasty and one of the most radical in the entire history of pharaonic Egypt. No woman in the recorded history of the Egyptian state had ever claimed the full titulary of a pharaoh, No woman had ever adopted the male regalia of kingship, the false beard, the kilt, the double crown. No woman had ever presented herself, in the inscriptions and the reliefs of her monuments, as a king in every sense of the word, indistinguishable from her male predecessors, except in the occasional use of feminine grammatical forms that the scribes, perhaps through habit, or perhaps through deliberate policy, retained in some of the texts. The relationship between Hatshepsut's extraordinary career and the legacy of Thutmose II is one of the most complex and most debated questions in Egyptology. Did Hatshepsut seize power because her husband had been weak, because the brevity and the modesty of his reign had created a power vacuum that a woman of her intelligence and ambition was uniquely positioned to fill? Or did she seize power for her own reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her husband's governance, and everything to do with her own belief that she, as the daughter of Thutmose I and the bearer of the legitimate royal bloodline, had a stronger claim to the throne than the child who had inherited it from his father? The conventional narrative has tended toward the first interpretation, presenting Thutmose II as a weak king whose inadequacy made Hatshepsut's assumption of power both possible and, in a sense, necessary. But the tomb discovery complicates this narrative. If Thutmose II was buried with full royal honours, if his wife ensured that his tomb was prepared according to the highest standards of pharaonic funerary practice, then the relationship between the two was not one of simple contempt. It was more nuanced, more layered, more human than the textbook version suggests, and the possibility that Thutmose II was a perfectly competent ruler whose memory was deliberately diminished by a successor with her own reasons for doing so becomes not just plausible but, in the light of the tomb evidence, increasingly likely. And now we arrive at the question that has been building beneath the surface of this entire story. The question that the tomb in the Wadi Gabana el-Qurud poses not just to Egyptology, but to anyone who has ever thought about the nature of memory, the meaning of legacy, and the relationship between what actually happened and what we choose to remember. What does it mean to be forgotten? Not to die. Death is universal, expected, the common lot of every human being who has ever lived. But to be forgotten, to have your name erased, your achievements minimized, your face reworked into someone else's likeness, your tomb lost beneath the sand for 35 centuries, while the tombs of the people around you are found, catalogued, studied, and celebrated, that is something different. That is a second death, a death of memory, a death that is in some ways more complete than the death of the body, because the body at least remains, wrapped in its linen, lying in its coffin, waiting to be found. The memory, once lost, may never be recovered. Thutmose II experienced this second death, this death of memory, this dissolution of identity, this slow fading from the consciousness of the civilization he had served. For more than 3,000 years, from the end of the 18th Dynasty to the decipherment of hieroglyphics in the early 19th century, his name was unknown. His existence was unsuspected. The entire history of his reign, such as it was, lay buried beneath the accumulated silence of the millennia, waiting for the day when someone would dig through the sand and the rubble and the distortions of the historical record, and find, at the bottom of it all, the man himself, the fragments of alabaster inscribed with his name, duck-shaped vessels and a large jar, broken by the flood, scattered across the burial chamber floor, buried under the rubble of the collapsed ceiling, waiting in the silence of the sealed tomb for the archaeologist's brush to reveal the hieroglyphs that spelled out, after 35 centuries of obscurity, the name of the king who had been forgotten, the blue-painted ceiling with its stars and its sacred texts, the evidence that he had been buried as a king, that whatever later ages had made of him, the people who knew him had honoured him with the rituals that the gods required. Let that sink in. A pharaoh of the most powerful and most celebrated dynasty in Egyptian history. A man who sat on the throne of the world's greatest empire, who commanded armies, who was worshipped as a living god, was so thoroughly forgotten that the location of his tomb was unknown until the 21st century. His father's tomb was identified, however controversially. His wife's tomb was found. Her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari was found. His son's tomb was found. His grandson's tomb was found. His great-grandson's tomb was found. But his tomb, the place where his mortal remains were laid to rest, the chamber where the rituals of eternal life were performed on his behalf, the space that was supposed to guarantee his survival in the afterlife, was lost. For 3,500 years, the desert knew where Thutmose II was buried, and the human race did not. The fragility of historical memory is one of the most unsettling truths that the archaeological record reveals. We need to assume, in order to function, that the past is knowable, that the historical record is reasonably complete, that the people and events that we study are representative of the people and events that actually occurred. But the tomb of Thutmose II tells us otherwise. It tells us that the historical record is not a mirror of the past, but a filter, a screen that allows certain images through and blocks others, depending on the priorities, the biases, and the political agendas of the people who controlled the recording. The images that pass through the filter are the images of the powerful, the dramatic, the exceptional, the images that the scribes and the priests and the pharaohs chose to preserve. The images that are blocked are the images of the ordinary, the routine, the competent, the images that no one thought important enough to record, or that someone actively chose to suppress. How many other Thutmose IIs are there in the historical record? Pharaohs, kings, emperors, rulers whose reigns were perfectly competent, but whose memories were swallowed and consumed by the greater fame of the people around them. How many capable administrators, wise judges, effective governors have been erased from history, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too quietly, too steadily, too boringly to attract the attention of the chroniclers? We will never know. The evidence is gone, erased by time, destroyed by neglect, suppressed by the political calculations of successors who had their own stories to tell. The tomb of Thutmose II is a single data point, one recovery out of an unknown number of losses. But it reminds us that the losses are real, that the gaps in the record are not empty but full, and that the past we think we know is only a fraction of the past that actually occurred. Every civilization that has ever existed has produced thousands of people whose contributions were essential and whose names have been lost. Every dynasty has produced rulers whose competence sustained the dynasty through periods of quiet stability, and whose achievements were too modest, too successful, too uneventful, too unmarked by the crises that attract the attention of chroniclers to survive in the historical record. The tomb of Thutmose II is a single recovery from this vast archive of the lost, a single name restored from the silence, a single face given back its features, a single reign given back its context. But the recovery reminds us that the silence is not empty. It is full of people, full of stories, full of achievements that mattered enormously to the civilizations they served, and that the vagaries of historical memory have consigned to oblivion. The discovery changes the equation. It does not restore Thutmose II to the ranks of the great pharaohs. His achievements, however real, were not on the scale of his fathers or his sons, but it restores him to the ranks of the known, the documented, the attested, the real. He is no longer a gap in the record, a lacuna in the narrative, a blank space in the dynasty's portrait gallery, a lacuna in the king list, a name without a face and a face without a tomb. He is a pharaoh whose burial place has been found, whose funerary objects have been recovered, whose tomb architecture has been documented, and whose place in the landscape of the Theban necropolis, that vast, sacred, densely populated city of the dead on the west bank of the Nile, has been established for the first time in 3,500 years. The location of the tomb is itself significant and potentially revolutionary in its implications for our understanding of the early 18th Dynasty. The tomb is not in the Valley of the Kings. It is in the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud, a remote valley approximately 2.5 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings, in an area that had previously been associated with the burials of royal women rather than kings. The conventional assumption that the Valley of the Kings was the exclusive royal necropolis from the very beginning of the New Kingdom is one of the foundational assumptions of modern Egyptology. It has been taught in textbooks, presented in documentaries, and accepted as established fact by generations of scholars and students. The discovery of Thutmose II's tomb challenges this assumption directly. It suggests that the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty may not have been buried in the Valley of the Kings at all, that the valley we associate so strongly with the New Kingdom pharaohs may not have become the exclusive royal necropolis until later in the dynasty, perhaps not until the reign of Thutmose III or even later. This possibility has been suggested by several scholars in the wake of the 2025 announcement. Litherland himself has noted that the early 18th dynasty royal burials may have been dispersed across the Western Wadis, that the concentration of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings may represent a later development, perhaps initiated by Thutmose III or Amenhotep II rather than by Thutmose I, as the conventional narrative suggests. If Thutmose II was buried in the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud, and if his father, Thutmose I, was originally buried somewhere other than the Valley of the Kings, a possibility that remains open given the controversy about the identification of his tomb, then the Valley of the Kings may not have become the exclusive royal necropolis until the generation of Thutmose III. If this is the case, then the conventional narrative of New Kingdom burial practices needs to be revised, and the Western Wadis, the area surrounding the tomb of Thutmose II, needs to be explored far more thoroughly than it has been. This is the kind of discovery that does not merely add a new fact to the existing body of knowledge. It rearranges the body of knowledge itself, like an earthquake that does not merely shake the buildings but shifts the ground beneath them, forcing a reassessment not just of individual structures, but of the entire landscape on which they stand. For more than a century, the conventional wisdom held that the Valley of the Kings was the exclusive burial ground of the New Kingdom pharaohs, that every pharaoh from the 18th through the 20th dynasty was interred in the narrow, cliff-walled valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The discovery of Thutmose II's tomb in the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud, a valley that lies to the west of the Valley of the Kings, on the other side of a mountain ridge, breaks this assumption. It demonstrates that at least one pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and possibly others, was buried outside the Valley of the Kings, in a location that previous generations of archaeologists had assumed was reserved for royal women. The implications are significant. If the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were buried in the Western Wadis, rather than in the Valley of the Kings, then the entire chronology of royal burial practices in the New Kingdom needs to be reconsidered. The question of when the Valley of the Kings became the exclusive royal necropolis, a question that was previously considered settled, is now open again. The question of whether other royal tombs remain to be discovered in the Western Wadis, tombs that have been overlooked because the area was assumed to contain only the burials of queens, is suddenly urgent. And the question of the relationship between the early 18th dynasty burial practices and the later 18th dynasty practices that produced the famous tombs of the Valley of the Kings becomes a matter of active research rather than settled consensus. It rearranges the body of knowledge itself, forcing archaeologists to reconsider assumptions that had been accepted for decades, to look at familiar landscapes with new eyes, and to acknowledge that the map they had been using was incomplete. The Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud was supposed to contain the tombs of queens. It contains the tomb of a king. The Valley of the Kings was supposed to contain all the royal tombs of the New Kingdom. It does not. The mummy in the Cairo Museum was supposed to be Thutmose II. It may not be. Every certainty is now a question. Every assumption is now a hypothesis. And the answers, if they come, will come not from the library or the lecture hall, but from the desert, where a mound of rubble 23 meters high may conceal the last great archaeological discovery of the pharaonic age. The fact that the tomb was found by a team that was looking for something else is itself significant. Litherland and his team were not searching for the tomb of Thutmose II. They were conducting a systematic survey of the Western Wadis, looking for the tombs of royal women associated with the Thutmosid kings. The discovery of the tomb was, in Litherland's words, something they were not expecting to find, a surprise that disrupted their research plan and forced them to reconfigure their understanding of the landscape they had been studying for years. This element of surprise, the encounter with the unexpected, the discovery of something that was not supposed to be there, is one of the defining features of archaeological research. The desert does not organize its contents according to the categories of modern scholarship. It does not label its tombs. It does not sort its artifacts by dynasty, gender, or significance. It simply preserves what it is given, in whatever location the ancients chose, and waits for the modern excavator to find it, often in the last place anyone would have looked. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the 18th dynasty, and the tomb of Thutmose II is the evidence. For a century, Egyptology has constructed a narrative of this dynasty that places the great figures, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, at the centre and relegates everyone else to the margins. The discovery of Thutmose II's tomb challenges this narrative by reminding us that the margins are not empty. They are full of people, kings, queens, officials, priests, soldiers, craftsmen, whose stories have been lost not because they were unimportant, but because the people who controlled the historical record chose not to tell them. The recovery of these stories is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of civilizational self-understanding and self-correction, a process by which we correct the distortions of the historical record and construct a more complete, more honest, and more accurate picture of the past. The distortions are real, they are systematic, they are produced by the same forces, the biases of power, the preferences of narrative, the limitations of memory, that distort the record in every era and every civilization. And they can only be corrected by the same patient, methodical, unglamorous work that Litherland and his team exemplified in the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud. The work of digging through the rubble, reading the inscriptions, piecing together the fragments, and allowing the evidence, patiently, gradually, fragment by fragment, to tell a story that the official narrative had suppressed. The recovery of these stories, the patient, painstaking, often unglamorous work of finding the tombs, reading the inscriptions, piecing together the fragments of shattered vessels and collapsed ceilings, is the essential work of archaeology. It is the work of restoration, not of monuments but of memory, not of stone but of lives, not of the grand narrative of kings and conquests, but of the quieter, more human narrative of people who lived and worked and died and were buried and were forgotten and who deserve, after all this time, to be remembered. The 2025 discovery is a reminder that this work is far from complete. The Theban necropolis alone, the most intensively studied archaeological landscape in the world, may still contain undiscovered tombs, unread inscriptions, and unrecovered artifacts that could reshape our understanding of the New Kingdom and the civilization it produced. Beyond Thebes, the archaeological landscape of Egypt is vast, complex, and largely unexplored. The Delta, where the moisture and the agricultural activity have destroyed or concealed thousands of sites. The Fayum, where the buried capital of the Middle Kingdom lies beneath the water table. The Sinai, where the fortress towns of the New Kingdom frontier have barely been explored. The Nubian provinces, where the temples and fortresses of the Egyptian colonial administration lie drowned beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, or abandoned in the deserts of northern Sudan. The work of archaeology in Egypt is not a project that is nearing completion. It is a project that has barely begun. And the tomb of Thutmose II is a reminder of how much remains to be discovered. We have followed the story of Tut II from the shadows of the historical record to the sunlight of the Wadi Gabanat el-Qurud, from the silence of the sources to the eloquence of the alabaster fragments that bear his name. We have seen how a pharaoh of the greatest dynasty in Egyptian history was forgotten, erased by the political ambitions of his wife, overshadowed by the military achievements of his father and his son, lost to the distortions of a historical record that was written, rewritten, and rewritten again by the people who came after him. And we have seen how the desert, patient, indifferent, preserving, kept the memory that the human record had lost, holding it in the silence of a flooded tomb for 35 centuries until a team of archaeologists came looking for something else entirely, and found, instead, the answer to one of the oldest questions in Egyptology. What does this story mean for us? For anyone who has ever felt invisible in a world that reflexively celebrates the dramatic and the extraordinary, while taking the reliable and the competent for granted, it means, first and most fundamentally, that history is not what happened. History is what was recorded. And what was recorded was determined not by the events themselves, but by the people who controlled the recording. The 18th Dynasty produced some of the most prolific builders and inscribers in the history of the ancient world. Pharaohs who covered the walls of temples with exhaustive accounts of their military campaigns, their building projects, their religious devotions, and their relationships with the gods. But the records they produced were not neutral accounts of events. They were political documents, crafted to serve the interests of the ruling pharaoh, designed to legitimize his or her authority, and willing to distort, suppress, or fabricate information when the truth was inconvenient. The literary and inscriptional record of the 18th Dynasty, the texts on which our understanding of the period is based, was produced by scribes who served the reigning pharaoh, who wrote what the pharaoh approved, and who understood that their careers and their lives depended on producing records that reflected the pharaoh's version of events rather than some abstract notion of historical accuracy. The concept of objective historical truth, the idea that the record should describe what actually happened rather than what the ruler wanted people to believe had happened, did not exist in ancient Egypt. The inscriptions were not journalism. They were propaganda, beautifully crafted, linguistically sophisticated, theologically elaborate propaganda that served the interests of the person who commissioned them. The record of Thutmose II's reign is a case study in this phenomenon, a record that has been shaped at every point by the agendas of the people who wrote it. The implications extend beyond Egyptology to the way we understand all historical records, in all periods, in all civilizations. Every historical source is a product of its time, written by someone, for someone, with a purpose that shaped what was included and what was left out. The challenge for the historian, and for the archaeologist, whose evidence is material rather than textual, is to read through the agendas, to identify the distortions, to reconstruct the reality that lies behind the record rather than accepting the record itself as reality. The tomb of Thutmose II is a lesson in this discipline, a reminder that the reality is always more complex than the record suggests, and that the most important evidence is sometimes found not in the texts but in the ground. It means, second, that the work of maintenance is essential and invisible, and that the people who do it deserve to be remembered. Every civilization produces its builders, its conquerors, its innovators, the people whose achievements are dramatic enough to attract the attention of historians and the imagination of the public. But every civilization also depends on its maintainers, the people who keep the systems running, who preserve the institutions that the builders created, who ensure that the lights stay on, and the roads stay open, and the borders stay secure. The maintainers are rarely celebrated. They are rarely even noticed. But without them, the achievements of the builders would crumble within a generation. Thutmose II was a maintainer. He kept the empire running. He kept the army ready. He kept the temples supplied. He kept the peace. And for this service, this essential, invisible, utterly necessary service, he was forgotten. History remembers the builders and the destroyers. It remembers the pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates, and the pharaoh who shattered every convention and made herself king, and the pharaoh who fought the battle of Megiddo. It does not remember the pharaoh who kept the irrigation canals clean, who ensured that the granaries were stocked for the lean years, who maintained the diplomatic correspondence with the vassal states, who inspected the frontier garrisons, who heard the petitions of the farmers and the merchants and the widows who came to the royal court seeking justice. These are the acts that sustain a civilization. These are the acts that make the dramatic achievements of the builders and the conquerors possible. And these are the acts that vanish from the historical record as completely as footprints vanish from the sand, erased not by malice but by the simple, inexorable process by which the dramatic inevitably displaces the routine, the exceptional displaces the ordinary, and the story of the hero displaces the story of the thousands of ordinary people whose labour made the hero's achievements possible. The tomb of Thutmose II is a corrective to this process. It is a reminder that the routine is not insignificant, that the pharaoh who kept the irrigation canals clean contributed as much to the survival of Egyptian civilization as the pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates. It is a reminder that the historical record is a product of human choices. Choices about what to record and what to omit, what to celebrate and what to ignore, what to preserve and what to allow to be forgotten. And it is a reminder that the desert, which makes no such choices, which preserves everything with equal indifference, sometimes gives us back the things that human memory has lost. And these are the acts that vanish from the historical record as completely as footprints vanish from the sand. The tomb in the Wadi, flooded, damaged, stripped of its treasures but not of its identity, is his vindication. It is the evidence that he existed, that he mattered, that the people who knew him, who served him, who worked alongside him, who mourned him when he died, honoured him as a king, and that the civilization he served valued him enough to bury him according to the highest rituals of their faith. It means, third, that the past is never fully known. The discovery of Thutmose II's tomb, the last missing tomb of the 18th Dynasty, found not in the Valley of the Kings, where everyone expected it to be, but in a remote wadi where no one was looking, is a reminder that the archaeological record is fundamentally and permanently incomplete, and that the assumptions we build on it are provisional. The map of the Theban necropolis, which seemed so well established and so thoroughly explored, turned out to have a blank space, a space that contained the tomb of a pharaoh. If the Theban necropolis can still surprise us, the most intensively, the most continuously, and the most thoroughly excavated archaeological landscape in the world, studied by thousands of scholars over 2 centuries. The Theban necropolis covers an area of approximately 4 square kilometers, a compact but archaeologically dense landscape that includes the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, the Western Wadis, the mortuary temples of the New Kingdom pharaohs, the private tombs of the Theban nobility, and the village of Deir el-Medina, where the royal tomb workers lived and worked. This landscape has been explored, excavated, and studied by thousands of scholars over 2 centuries. From the early 19th century expeditions of Belzoni and Champollion, through the great excavations of the 20th century by Carter, Carnarvon, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to the ongoing work of modern survey teams equipped with satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other technologies that would have seemed like magic to the pioneers of the field. And yet, in 2025, this landscape, arguably the most thoroughly and continuously studied archaeological site on the surface of the earth, produced a surprise that no one expected. The tomb of a pharaoh, hidden for 3,500 years in a valley that everyone assumed contained only the burials of queens. If the Theban necropolis can still surprise us, then what other surprises are waiting in the landscapes that have not been so thoroughly explored? What other pharaohs are buried in places we have not looked? What other forgotten kings are waiting, in the silence of their tombs, for the day when the archaeologist trowel, or shovel, or brush, or ground-penetrating radar breaks through the rubble and the light falls, for the first time in millennia, on the painted walls and the inscribed stones and the shattered vessels that hold, in their fragments, the names of the forgotten. And it means, finally, that the desert has a longer memory than any dynasty. Hatshepsut tried to erase her husband from history. Thutmose III tried to erase his stepmother. The priests of later dynasties tried to protect the royal dead by moving them from their original tombs to hidden caches in the cliffs. The tomb robbers tried to steal the treasures that the pharaohs had taken with them into eternity. And through it all, through the erasures and the restorations, the thefts and the rescues, the floods and the collapses, the millennia of silence and forgetting, the desert preserved what the human world had lost. The tomb was there, the inscriptions were there, the evidence was there, silent, patient, undisturbed, waiting, preserved by the same aridity that had preserved the mummies of the pharaohs and the papyri of the scribes and the painted walls of the tombs that make the Theban necropolis the most extraordinary archaeological landscape on earth. The desert does not forget, It does not play favorites. It does not distinguish between the pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates and the pharaoh who kept the irrigation canals clean. It does not erase. It does not rewrite the record to serve the interests of the powerful. It simply preserves, indifferently, patiently, eternally, whatever is given to it. And what it gave back, in February of 2025, was the tomb of a pharaoh who had been missing for 3,500 years. The dynasty that buried him is gone. The priests who prepared his tomb are dust. The scribes who wrote the Amduat on his walls have been dead for 3 millennia. The flood that destroyed his burial chamber occurred before the founding of Rome, before the rise of classical Greece, before the composition of the oldest books of the Hebrew Bible. The time that separates us from Thutmose II is so vast, so incomprehensible, that the human mind struggles to hold it, struggles to understand that the broken alabaster jar that Litherland's team pieced together in a field laboratory in Luxor was crafted by human hands, inscribed by human tools, and placed in a tomb by human mourners who believed, with perfect sincerity, that the sacred rituals they performed would ensure their king's survival in the afterlife for all eternity. They were right, not in the way they intended, but in a way that they could never have imagined. Thutmose II did not survive in the afterlife of the Egyptian theological imagination, the celestial realm where the pharaoh sailed with the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of the night and was reborn each morning with the dawn. But he survived in the afterlife of human memory, the fragile, imperfect, easily distorted but stubbornly persistent archive of knowledge about the past that we call history. His name survived on the alabaster, his tomb survived in the wadi, and his story, the story of the pharaoh who was forgotten and who was found, survived in the most durable medium of all, the stubbornly persistent human capacity for curiosity, for wonder, and for the refusal to accept that the past is unknowable simply because it is past. It is late, the wadi is dark. The stars above Gabanat el-Karud are the same stars that the tomb painters reproduced on the ceiling of Thutmose II's burial chamber, yellow dots against a deep blue ground, the image of the eternal night sky that the pharaoh was meant to see above him as he lay in his sarcophagus when he opened his eyes in the afterlife and began his journey through the 12 hours of the Amduat. The ceiling has collapsed now. The stars are buried under rubble. The blue paint is flaking from the plaster, fading, molecule by molecule, returning to the mineral components from which the ancient pigment makers extracted it, losing the vivid azure that the painters had applied with such care to the freshly laid plaster 3,500 years ago. In another 1,000 years, perhaps in another 500, the paint may be gone entirely, the celestial imagery dissolved into the geological substrate. The stars that were meant to guide the pharaoh's nocturnal journey through the underworld reduced to a faint chemical trace that only a laboratory instrument could detect. Time is patient, time is thorough, time does not negotiate. And the evidence that the 2025 excavation recovered, the photographs, the measurements, the chemical analyses, the plaster fragments preserved in climate-controlled storage facilities, may in the end be the only record of what the tomb painters created in the 15th century BC. The flood that destroyed the tomb within 6 years of the pharaoh's burial has left its mark in the sediment lines on the walls. High water marks that record with the precision of a geological instrument, the moment when the desert turned against the dead king and tried to wash him from the record. But the record survived, in fragments, in the broken pieces of an alabaster jar, duck-shaped, as the 18th Dynasty craftsmen made them, a form so common in royal burials that it constitutes a kind of funerary signature, inscribed with a name that a Scottish archaeologist pieced together in a field laboratory in Luxor. Hatshepsut, Thutmose, the deceased king, 3 words, carved in the soft stone of an alabaster jar that solved a mystery that had persisted since the birth of modern Egyptology, and that restored to the historical record the name of a man who had been absent from it for longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire, longer than the entire history of Christianity, longer than the combined histories of every nation-state that exists in the modern world. In the blue plaster chips that carry the sacred, ancient, reverently copied words of the Amduat, the book that guided the pharaoh through the darkness of the underworld and delivered him, at the end of the night, into the light of a new dawn. In the architectural plan of the tomb itself, the wide staircase, the imposing doorway, the descending corridor, the burial chamber, that marked it as a royal tomb, a king's tomb, the tomb of a pharaoh who had been buried with the honours that his rank demanded, and that his wife, whatever she did afterward, had ensured he received. The archaeologist's work is not glamorous. It is not the work of Indiana Jones, the dashing adventurer who cracks open tombs and dodges booby traps in pursuit of golden idols. It is the work of extraordinary, sustained, year after year patience, the patient removal of rubble, the patient documentation of pottery fragments, the patient analysis of sediment deposits and plaster chips, and the chemical composition of ancient pigments. It is the work of years of 10-year survey projects that produce, most seasons, nothing more exciting than a more detailed map of the landscape and a more comprehensive and more detailed catalogue of the surface pottery and other archaeological remains. And then, one day, the ground gives way, the sand shifts, the rubble parts, and behind it, behind all the patience and all the documentation and all the unglamorous, unrecognised, essential work of systematic archaeological research, is a staircase descending into darkness, a doorway carved into rock, wide enough for a sarcophagus to pass through, tall enough for a man to walk upright, cut with the precision that 3 millennia of Egyptian stoneworking had perfected. A corridor leading to a chamber where, on the walls, between the cracks left by an ancient flood, the yellow stars of a pharaoh's ceiling are still visible, painted by hands that mixed pigment and applied it to wet plaster 3,500 years ago, and that trusted, with a faith that has been vindicated, against all odds, against all expectation, against the floods and the earthquakes and the tomb robbers and the millennia of silence, that the desert would preserve what they had made. The faith was justified. The desert kept its promise. The evidence survived. And the pharaoh who was forgotten, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the man who stood between giants, who governed between earthquakes, and who vanished into the gap between their achievements, has been given back his name. The discovery of the tomb of Thutmose II is a vindication of this kind of work, the slow, patient, methodical kind of archaeology that does not make headlines until it does, that does not produce dramatic results until it does, that does not change the understanding of an entire era of history until, suddenly, it does. So here is the answer to the question that has been building, quietly and insistently, through this long night. What does it mean to be the pharaoh history forgot? It means that your story is not over. It means that the silence that has surrounded your name, the vast, encompassing, seemingly permanent silence for 3,500 years, is not the final word, that the desert has been keeping your secret, holding your evidence, preserving the fragments of your identity in the darkness of a flooded until the day when someone comes looking. It means that the people who tried to erase you, who replaced your name with theirs, who reworked your images, who minimized your achievements and maximized their own, did not succeed. Not completely, not permanently. Because the alabaster survived, the inscription survived, the blue paint survived, and the name, your name, Pharaoh Thutmose, survived with them, carried across the millennia, by the same stone that the craftsman carved, and the same pigment that the painters mixed, and the same faith that motivated the priests, who prepared your tomb for the journey through the underworld. Thutmose II was not, by the standards of the spectacular, a great pharaoh. He was not a conqueror, not a builder of temples that stagger the imagination, not a warrior whose campaigns fill the walls of monumental temples of monuments for miles. He was a man who sat on the throne of the world's greatest empire for a handful of years, who kept the machinery running, who suppressed the rebellions and defended the borders and maintained the rituals that the gods required and passed the kingdom, intact and functional and ready for whatever the next generation would demand of it, to the next generation. He was, above all else, a maintainer, and maintainers are the people civilizations depend on most and remember least. But the desert remembered, and Piers Litherland found what the desert had kept. And now, for the first time in 3,500 years, The pharaoh who was forgotten has a tomb, a name on alabaster, and a place in the story of the civilization he served. It is not a large place. It is not a glorious place. It is a flooded chamber in a remote wadi, with collapsed ceilings and broken jars, and the faded remnants of sacred texts on plaster that is slowly turning to dust. But it is his. It belongs to no one else. It was not appropriated by Hatshepsut, not claimed by Thutmose III, not reassigned to a different pharaoh by the priests who reorganized the royal burials during the 21st dynasty. It is his, the one place in the archaeological record that belongs, unambiguously and exclusively, to Thutmose II. It is the evidence, modest, fragmentary, damaged by flood and time, but real, tangible, undeniable, that he lived, that he ruled, that he was buried as a king, and that the desert, which has no politics, no agenda, no ambition, chose to remember him when the dynasties and the scholars and the centuries did not. The cold, clear, ancient stars above the wadi are the same stars that were painted on his ceiling, the same stars that he was meant to see when he opened his eyes in the afterlife, the same stars that have been shining, constant and unchanged, since before there were pharaohs to name them and priests to paint them and archaeologists to find them in the rubble of a tomb that the flood tried to destroy and the desert chose to preserve. He is found now. After 35 centuries of silence and forgetting and erasure, he is found. After all this time, after 35 centuries of silence, after generations of scholars searching in the wrong valley, after a dynasty of successors who erased his name and appropriated his monuments and left him, alone among the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, without a known tomb, he is found, and the desert which kept him is satisfied. The work is not finished. The second tomb, if it exists, if it contains what Litherland believes it contains, remains to be excavated. The alabaster fragments remain to be fully analysed. The Amduat texts remain to be reconstructed from the broken plaster chips that the flood scattered across the burial chamber floor. The mummy in the Cairo Museum remains to be definitively identified or definitively rejected as someone other than Thutmose II. The full story of this pharaoh's life, reign, death, and afterlife, the story that the tomb has begun to tell, but that years of further research will be needed to complete, remains to be written. But the first chapter has been opened. The tomb is found. The name is read. The blue-painted stars, faded, flaking, slowly dissolving into the plaster from which they emerged 3,500 years ago, have been photographed, documented, and preserved in the records of the New Kingdom Research Foundation, where they will endure long after the last flakes of pigment have fallen from the ceiling of the burial chamber, and the desert has reclaimed what the desert has always owned. The patient, indifferent, all-remembering desert has given back what the ambitious dynasties and the centuries and the floodwaters took away. And the pharaoh who was forgotten, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who kept the empire running while history looked the other way, has at last been found.